Like 10 years ago, first started to mess around with the stuff, I was like just finishing high school, going to college, being like, this is going to be awesome. It's going to change tomorrow. And now
I think over the next 10 years, many more assets will become tokenized, and those will be traditional assets like RWAs, national currencies, and then there'll also be meme coins.
I don't think the meme coins are that answer. And if anything, it's actually the opposite of what you're training people to do. But I think slowly, like Ethereum's values of the sort of like decentralized ownership, wanting to contribute to something that you own because you want to build a better world, these like philosophies are slowly disseminating out. I am seeing that. I was on the ski lift here the other day, and this kid was talking about like, Ethereum and smart contracts. Like,
yeah, we're learning about it at school, and like our friends are talking about it.
Wow, that's a very impressive school. If you want to do money laundering, you make a bank. That's the same evilness as the idea that if you want to do something fucked up with a token, you should make a DAO. And so I think that like we keep going through the universe, and another 50 years or another 300 years, there will be many new like amazing novel use cases and many more like evil, shitty use cases. And that's just like a reality of the technology being used. All tokens will be DAOs and all DAOs will be tokens. And that was before any token had called themselves a DAO. I think the challenging thing is like, as you start to look at allocating a token airdrop, and then you start to look at the number of users that fall into each category, very quickly you run out of tokens.
Welcome to the Allo.Capital podcast powered by the Green Pill Network. If you're just joining us, we are doing seasons on the Green Pill podcast. And this season, we are summoning Allo.Capital, a new spin-out from Gitcoin that is designed to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. I think that there's big upside here for Gitcoin and for the wider Web3 community. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space, and VCs, governments, NGOs, and DAOs all have to allocate capital to survive and reach their goals. But it is also a place where you can start small. Every time you spend money, you are allocating capital. Things like buying coffee, things like buying things on the internet are all examples of allocating capital. And so there's a whole spectrum of needs in design space here. And I think that the on-chain primitives that we're inventing in Ethereum are going to change how we allocate capital. On this podcast, we are threading a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what on-chain capital allocation will look like and building it on-chain. If you want to learn more, visit our website at allo.capital, where you can download the Allo books for free, play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO design contest proposal. Our guest today is James Waugh. James Waugh is a founder of FireEyes, which is a DAO design consultancy that helps build innovative Web3 DAO ecosystems. James and I worked together on the Gitcoin DAO design back in 2021. And so it's exciting to bring him back and to talk about the Allo Capital design space and DAO design. So on this episode, we talk about on-chain capital allocation. What are his most exciting use cases? What are the ways that he thinks that we should design the Allo DAO? What are the open problems in the DAO design ecosystem? And how can the most leading innovations in DAO design be applied to Allo.Capital? So this was a fun episode. I'm always excited to talk to James, and I think you're going to enjoy it as well. Hi, James. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. We are summoning Allo Capital, and I really wanted to talk to you about it because you helped design Gitcoin back in the day, and you and I go way back from those experiences, and wanted to hear about your recent work with FireEyes and how you've been doing DAO design and how the state of the state has evolved over the last couple of years. So maybe you could just kind of tee us off and tell us about FireEyes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, and definitely stoked to see how, you guys are thinking about Allo can be used inside of different protocols to deploy, capital inside of Ethereum in a meaningful way and not just like spammy meme coins that have become the norm. But I am from FireEyes, and initially we started it in sort of 2016, 2017 as like tokens were first getting their kickoff and sort of continued to develop in that direction. Really just being like an encyclopedia of all token strategies and how they should launch and how to do an airdrop and all those kind of mechanics. We spend all of our time thinking about how those things work. And so we've worked alongside many of the coolest protocols in the universe, like Gitcoin, Optimism, Super Rare, Rocket Pool, recently with some little bit with Eigenlayer and Scroll. But really sort of like we pick the most high impact projects to Ethereum, and then we say, we want to work with you. And to date, no one has said go away yet, which is lucky. But really like trying to work out what is going to be the most high impact with Ethereum and then try like help them on that journey. And so sometimes that might be, sitting down with a founder at an event, for a few hours and being like, all right, what's most stressful, and doing some sort of founder therapy type stuff. Or it might be, working with a project for like 18 months, sort of going into a token launch and really workshopping on like how do we want to distribute it, what should it do, and how do we make sure that the token is sort of the highest impact it can be.
So I guess my sort of reductionist summary is that projects hire you to help them deploy their first initial governance and token allocation, DAO summoning type stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, if you're cheap, you can just invite you on a podcast episode and get the advice for free.
Exactly, exactly. Or, actually for a lot of the work we do, if we're friends, we'll happily do a shit ton of work, with sort of no expectation. Because if it's high, if we view it as high impact, then like that's actually the measurement. And like Ethereum succeeding is worth a lot more to us than like any individual token succeeding. And so sort of like creating the foundation so that those wins can happen is a big part of
Yeah.
our work.
I'm an ETH bag holder too, so I get it.
Exactly.
Little sad laugh there. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about is the state of DAO design, and where I want to start, I think, is where our relationship, or at least our professional relationship, begins, and that's in 2021. Gitcoin's exiting consensus, and it needs to become a DAO because we want to be credibly neutral, and we want to fund public goods in a credibly neutral way, and we want to be governed by our users as opposed to being a company that's governed by just investors. I think that we worked together with you in Delphi Digital on the Gitcoin launch, and tracing that back, I think that there's been a lot of lessons over the years for running a DAO and executing a DAO and being involved in a DAO. Um, and the state of DAOs has evolved, from my perspective, a lot over the last 4 years. How would you trace DAOs in 2021 versus DAOs in 2025? What are the big shifts that you're seeing in the projects that you advise?
Well, and I think that like there's an interesting distinction there between like I think back then, DAOs were only just getting their kickstart. First of all, of tokens calling themselves DAOs was pretty early. But second, that like the meta cartels and these sort of like more community centric efforts, that we actually were DAOs in a sense that everyone is aligned and we know everyone inside of it and we sort of want the same outcomes. That was like the purest DAO was almost in its heyday, I think then. And so that, like everyone liked that idea and was really resonating with it. And so that led to a lot of these token projects adopting the same like language and methodology to describe what they were building, which was like, we want a big community. We want everyone to be bought in. We want everyone to be aligned. Sort of what's the language that we should use to describe that? And so maybe 2020, but really like 2021 forward, I think we saw, the shift. I think it was maybe a year earlier than that. I wrote this article called like all tokens will be DAOs and all DAOs will be tokens. And that was before any token had called themselves self a DAO. And that was really sort of like seeing this vision through of like, what the DAO, the original one, wanted to be. And then this sort of spin out of like 1,000,001 different tokens. And it's like, how do you like reconcile those two things, right? Like, how do we pull the DAO ideology that was sort of launched in 2017 into like all of these different tokens that existed. And so that was what I think we saw then. Sort of fast forward from going from when there was a handful of these token DAOs and a handful more of these community DAOs to now like I think someone said it's like 200,000, like hundreds of thousands of DAOs. Now, what that actually means, I think, is a very meaningless question. Like anyone can sort of spin up and make their token DAO or their, multi-sig and call it a DAO. But still, we have gone from 0 to 1, right? Where there was just like a 10 or 20 to now there being 20,000 even as a conservative estimation. That is really that has moved us a long way, but with it has come with a lot of noise. We maybe at the beginning there, majority of those were high impact, high development, whatever, to now like such a small portion of those 20,000 or 200,000 are doing anything useful. And I think that's like almost been reflected in the way that they, even for these bigger token DAOs, right, with like X number of $1 billion in the protocol or a token worth X hundred of millions of dollars. And they have these DAOs that are really like stuck in the mud. right? Where like there's the main people, and I've certainly seen this more recently of these like DAO service provider organizations, and they might be making proposals or helping you, shepherd your DAO, and like that's a valuable thing to be doing. But there are now there's like blood in the water, and now there's these sharks circling, that sort of like want to sort of show up and say, hey, well, we'll really help your DAO out, and all you have to do is pass $50,000 a month, and we'll really improve your DAO. And like that's the primary way that people are engaging with DAOs, as these like almost DAO service providers, which I like argued for. I want there to be more of these DAO service providers, but it's that you need to be doing stuff that isn't just service providing to the DAO so you can service provide some more. Like what are the tangible things of the way you engage a wider stakeholder group to actually like get some meaningful proposals going forward. And so I think, to summarize, of like the 2021 was like tokens had just realized they could become DAOs, and sort of like what that actually meant and what the downstream effects of that were really unknown. And now we're sort of, 4 years on, and maybe there's still a lot of unknown unknowns, but there's certainly the known, which is that just slapping the word DAO on your token, doesn't mean that people are going to care. And actually, if anything, might harm, how people engage with your protocol.
Do you think that I think DAOs were pretty hot in 2021. Do you think that that term is ascendant or descendant or kind of just leveled off into the background, the cosmic background noise of the space?
It's funny, it's like almost since then, maybe, a year earlier even, of like, it was like the year of the DAO, and I remember like 2020 was that, and then 2021 was that, and then maybe 2022 wasn't, but then 2023 was that, and it's sort of been this like continuous sort of circle of people wanting it to be the years that DAOs really get traction. And as I've sort of gone from inception of the term, to now, it really feels like that idea that it's going to be the year of the DAOs is actually missing the mark. It's like, we don't have the year of the startup, or the year of the company. It's like, actually, these are just like terms that we use in the background that's like are just like infrastructural or sort of philosophical frames of mind of how you coordinate, right? Of like, are we in a co-op, or are we in a company, or are we in a DAO? Like it's not the year of that thing. It's that it's like a tangential background thing that's like helpful for the way that you push forward. And so I think DAOs have certainly fallen out of the limelight. And even when you talk to investors, right, like DAO tooling in 2020 was hot. Like every investor was making a DAO tooling investment. And now, if you are even near to that being a DAO tooling example, no one will touch you. None of these firms, because they've all been burnt from these investments they made, 3 years ago that were like DAO tooling. And then you're like, oh shit, how do I monetize this? How do I launch a token around this? When actually it's like a tooling infrastructure. And so I'd say we probably have fallen off in hotness. And certainly there's a lot of talk on crypto Twitter, at least, of like, you're running a DAO or you want to be a DAO, what are you even doing? What is it? I think there's actually probably some negative connotation that didn't exist back then.
Well, I definitely bought the DAO hype in 2021. That's why we made Gitcoin a DAO, and I think there was a good reason for that. We wanted to be democratically governed. Not all DAOs are democratically governed, but that was our North Star for Gitcoin, at least initially. And I think we learned a lot over the years. And I wrote a book called How to DAO, which it took us 3 years to get it out. And by the time it was out, I think DAOs aren't as hot anymore. But I just think it's such a fascinating design space. I mean, we're basically going from the LLC and the company being the best way that we can organize humans towards a shared goal. And now we have blockchains as the ultimate coordination substrate. And I think that we're 5 years into DAOs, and the LLC is like, well, the corporation is 300 years old. The LLC is like 50 years old. I think if DAOs just cook for another like 10 or 15 years, we're going to see some really amazing stuff that's DAOs, or at least tokenized networks. And what would your reaction to that prediction be?
Yeah, I mean, I think 100%. And I think it's like, I don't actually think DAOs have done anything wrong in the past 5 years. I think a lot of people view it as like, oh, look how noisy they've become, or look how useless they've become. And it's like, no, this is just like scaling, and as we go from 20,000 meaningful DAOs, to 2 million meaningful DAOs, there will also be noise, and there will also, people are going to co-opt the term. It's like, is it DAO.build or DAO.fun, the Solana project, which is just like pump.fun. It's a copy paste, but like, where the money used to go to the liquidity providers, now it goes to some multi-sig controlled by one person. I don't quite know how it works, but it's certainly not a DAO. You're not launching a DAO when you press launch. You're launching a token, and that is a pump and dump for the most part. And like, that will continue to happen. And I think that like DAO will be used in a more malicious way, as the world goes on. But that's just a part of, same as companies, right? If you want to do money laundering, you make a bank. That's the same evilness as the idea that, if you want to do something fucked up with the token, you should make a DAO. And so I think that like to your point of as we keep going through the universe, in another 50 years or another 300 years, there will be many new like amazing novel use cases and many more like evil, shitty use cases. And that's just like a reality of the technology being used. Yeah.
I kind of look at it as an evolutionary environment where we go through these cycles of great abundance and then great scarcity. And then in the times of great scarcity, most of the projects die. And in the times of great abundance, the new keystone species are born. And so we're in this sort of like evolutionary design space where lots of experiments will blossom. And then the fittest survive. And instead of natural selection, it's market selection to see what survives year over year. And we're actually in kind of a funny, I've known you for a whole cycle now. And a lot of the projects that we were excited about 4 or 5 years ago are dying now because we've just gone through a whole cycle of life and death. So it's been a journey to see for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and like, one thing is the life and death of those projects, but the second is like how they were viewed at that time, right? Where like at the time it's like, oh wow, this is going to be the best solution,
It's
and
going
we're
to
100%
revolutionize
going to,
X.
yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
going to completely change the way that we do this, and then it's like, oh, actually, 3 years later, people stop using it. The airdrops happened, and it now has 0 users, and goodbye. And so, yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Well, I want to pivot the conversation to Allo now and what we're cooking up with Allo Capital. But before I do, anything else you want to say about tokenization and DAOs as a design space?
No, I think that, I mean, for any people listening or, watching this interested, I think that like experimentation is your friend, and I think that we got sort of like lost in this vision of like how a token and a DAO need to work together or what one should be for the other. I mean, like not to call out optimism maybe too much, but optimism when they first launched their DAO were very clear that like we want to innovate on the way that governance happens, right? And we expect this governance system to last 1 year, and then we want to reset it and look at what another one looks like. And that year came and went, and sort of we're still inside of the same system. And I think that a lot of projects fall into that mindset where it's like, oh, I want to innovate, in a year's time, let's imagine what this looks like. And then you get to a year's time and oh, fuck, there's too much else going on. I can't sort of
Yeah.
change it. And so keep doing random ideas, inside of this design space. And
Yeah.
if no one has done it, it's not a wrong answer. Assuming that you're not launching Libra and, going straight up and down within 2 hours.
Right. Well, you mentioning optimism is maybe kismet, as we segue to Allo, because, you and I know each other in the context of Gitcoin. Gitcoin's historically been a quadratic funding platform. And I think sometime in 2023 and 2024, actually, when I came back to Gitcoin, I was like, guys, we have to go multi-mechanism. The market isn't demanding quadratic funding anymore. And at that time, optimism was really ascendant with retro funding. And, arguably they still are. I think Optimism's a great brand. And Protocol Guild was really ascendant. And my primary message to Gitcoiners was, we're just going to be sitting ducks if we keep trying to be a quadratic funding protocol. And retro funding and guilds are just like taking off right now. And I think that was like a humbling moment for us, but it was also an exciting moment for me because I was like, "Ooh, I can get into mechanism design and maybe build something that's all about a multi-mechanism future for Gitcoin." And you actually wrote a post about retro funding when Optimism's retro funding was really taking off, and I remember that you were really excited about that a year ago. If you could just take me into that headspace for a minute or two, I think that'd be really cool to just hear what's exciting to you about retro funding now and then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and certainly, then, and that was at, not the most recent DevCon, but before that, DevConnect or whatever it was called in Istanbul. And the retro PGF stuff was very hot. Optimism that we're doing, that was just after they'd done the $150 million round, and like everyone, got an allocation, or a lot of projects got an allocation. And it was like setting precedent, and people are really excited by it. And I'm in the position that like, well, of the stance that like retroactive funding, regardless of what it looks like, right? Whether it's ETH or tokens, an airdrop is retroactive funding. And that's something that I think is like not really being thought about or talked about enough, is that the idea that like you are getting tokens based on what you did in the past, it is the same thing, as, hey, look, we're trying to assess how much impact you made, and we're going, Optimism is going to give you a grant because of it, right? Now you're getting some other random project tokens versus you're getting OP tokens, but the mechanism is the same. And so I've always been very, very bullish on like airdrops as a whole. Now retroactive funding is another way to say it, but airdrops. And the good thing about them is that you have all of the data, right? When you have a full data set of how users have been interfacing, or what people have done, you can sort of build whatever mechanism you want to reward them. and you have all of the parameters to play with, right? You know how many people showed up, you know what transactions they did or what impact they produced. And so then going through and trying to retroactively reward them is so much easier than these sort of forward-looking grants programs. Like I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm sure they're astronomical of like forward-looking grants, that have been given by protocols, by crypto protocols, would be in the billions. And, with all of that money, so little has been achieved, right? Because you sort of like get the money, you start building it, maybe you launch your own token, and you never look back to the organization that gave you that grant, right? Maybe there's some out of the EF, like ENS, for example, that's sort of one maybe that isn't in that. But I'd say for the majority, when you get this like free money up front to build something, it doesn't really net to good outcomes. And so during that time, I was like super excited about, retro funding and how that could happen. And so I sort of did this post like calling out a bunch of the projects that FireEyes did specifically, that FireEyes had worked with to be like, hey, you should go and do this round. And so sort of like had some conversations with Aave, had some conversations with Rockapool, and they're both like, oh, I don't know, seems too scary. Maybe we won't do it. Pocket Network ended up doing it. And they, had some really cool success and some really nice outcomes that were achieved from that. But I was sort of like, why is no one else doing this? And I was sort of quite sheepish to share that article because I was scared that I had such a good idea that something like, Binance was going to steal it and do Binance retroactive funding and use BNB to reward people that have down their ecosystem. And so I was really guarded with that article, and then I released it. And I was like, "Go, go, go, quick! Let's do our retro funding before the lame actors get involved." And then like no one did it, and Binance didn't do it, and like one or two of the projects I suggested did it, and like I think that still made impact. I'm not like sad about it, doing that. But certainly it was a lot less high impact than I thought it was going to be. And like I really thought that like, Solana doing this, would make so much sense. You can sort of steal the social capital that's been developed on the Infinite Garden side of the fence and bring it back to the evil forest, that like made I really thought that was going to happen. And to see like such little other types of funding rounds or retroactive funding rounds that have taken place since then is pretty surprising. But I think that like I don't want that to throw away the baby with the bathwater, that like, oh, this is just like a bad idea. I still think that like retroactive funding in some way, shape, or form, right? You can use badges or on-chain metrics or whatever you want to qualify that. But using retroactive funding in that way is, I think, still the best way to incentivize a community where you want to work hard, hopefully because you like the project, but also because you don't know how you're going to be evaluated in the future. And so you're sort of constantly in this race of like, I should act good, act well, I should build cool stuff, I should make high impact, because you don't know how the rewards are going to flow. And when you start flowing, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars through these types of mechanisms, people will listen and pay attention. Versus if you put 100 million out in a forward-looking grant of like, hey, we're picking 5 companies to give $20 million to build something for us this year, you just will not get the same impact as if you did 100 million in retrospect. Now, there's also like, well, I can't just build for free, right? And I get that of like, it sort of requires like a privilege almost to sort of get retroactive funding in that way, because you have to sort of build up to that. But I think there's like, there's other forms of grants, or maybe you can unlock some of it when you at day one if you really need it. There's like different mechanisms we can use to experiment there. But the idea that retroactive funding has, that meme has become less prominent, in the past year, I think that's more of like an industry blip than it is like a long-term outlook.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you sort of play that back. I've been really excited about retro funding since it came out. We've worked with Optimism on the voting UI for retro funding, and actually ended up spinning that out as a tool called Easy Retro PGF, which actually my reentry to Gitcoin was like, hey, I built this retro funding tool and you guys are trying to go multi-mechanism now. We ran rounds with Cello and Pocket and a handful of others, and it's been neat to see other retro rounds happen amongst the community. But yeah, I agree that it's definitely gone through this sort of like peak of inflated expectations, and now like we're sort of climbing the slope of productivity. And it's been interesting to bring retro funding into Gitcoin, and Gitcoin now has a formal retro funding product that's real supported. We're going to be doing retro funding in GG23 that's coming up. And so that design space continues to be explored. And just a shout out to Carl Carvona and Jonas from Optimism for being the ones that shepherded that space forward. And I think what I want to do here is I want to segue into talking about Allo Capital, which is our new play at trying to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. So you can kind of imagine like an operating system where quadratic funding and retro funding are just the first apps But deep funding is going to be an app that we deploy. And then we're going to have like a whole bunch of different tools that will allow DAOs to democratically allocate capital to what matters to them. And so this new venture is going to be all about building tools for builders, technology for builders, helping builders get funded that are building funding infrastructure, and trying to summon that capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. And so I think that the way I want to volley this back to you is that, like, our thesis at a high level, love to just hear you react to this, is that I think over the next 10 years, many, many more assets will become tokenized, and those will be traditional assets like RWAs, national currencies, and then there'll also be meme coins that are tokenized. And the people behind those tokens are going to want to allocate them to create whatever impact or profit in their community. And if we can just build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet, that will be a multi-billion-dollar opportunity, because so many assets are going to be tokenized and want to be deployed. And it probably won't be quadratic funding, and it won't be retro funding. It'll be whatever comes after that. So we're building this superstructure that's going to fund the builders and empower the builders of that. So, if you could just kind of like react to that thesis and maybe steelman the case for and against it, of where you're bullish on it and where you're sort of bearish on it. I'd love to sort of start there.
I think in principle, certainly bullish, and like the idea that much more money will move on chain and it will become tokenized and not strictly, I do wonder about like, the RWA sense of like, how all oil or all gold becomes tokenized and then how we sort of
Yep.
use that to like flow back to
Sorry, what's
humans.
IWA?
No, R.
Oh, RWA. Okay,
Yeah,
got
yeah.
it. It's the New
Yeah.
Zealand accent.
It's the
Our
New
real
Zealand
world
accent.
assets, RWAs. Yeah.
Exactly. Like the real world
I,
assets and sort
I'll
of
pay
like,
you. I'll pay you 2 barrels of oil for this episode, for appearing on this episode, James.
exactly. Like how that actually ends up working with like, if those types of organizations that actually do, because I think 100% like those assets will become on chain in different ways. Now, will they use, unique and experimental ways to distribute capital back to their communities? Like, I don't know, maybe, but like maybe not, and so, how necessarily these mechanisms and the use of them scale compared to like the total assets on chain. Like I would guess,
Mm,
the assets on chain will scale much quicker and we won't actually get like all of the people that put assets on chain or tokenize things, using these types of mechanisms. I think that's probably, the starting point is I think it will be slow. And, if it took 100 years for capitalism to reach it, or, maybe more, but for capitalism to reach its like tipping point of like, okay, now we're in some failure state, like we need these new mechanisms that we're describing here, then actually it's going to take a long time for these mechanisms to be seriously useful. Like again, thinking about the timeline of the internet from when it was first started to be ideated on, whatever in the 70s, 80s to then like it being properly used, in the 2010s. Thinking about that kind of timeline is like, okay, this is going to take a long time. And so I don't know how quickly um, all value of the world starts to flow through these mechanisms. However, I do think that like people are going to coordinate online more and more and more, and they are going to need a way to distribute money through that. And that, might be small chunks of money. Like we have a friend group and we want to work out what to do with it. And so we use, some tooling like Allo, to sort of distribute that money. Or it's like, hey, we have a multi-billion-dollar business, and we want to distribute the revenue in a way, that isn't just a strict dividend, but something slightly more complicated to people that have been building the thing or contributing to the thing. 100% that happens. And so I think, the idea of building those tool sets, for the world that we're moving into 100%, but how they get adopted and how they get used feels so random that even like I would say that me and you and others inside of the ecosystem are very in the know about these types of questions, right? Like at the bleeding edge of where the space is going and sort of trying to having conversations on a daily basis and like tap into the directionality here. And still, we post articles going, oh yeah, everyone's going to use this new mechanism. And then like very few people do. And so, if we are so informed and still we can't guess, then I think it will be like a slow journey and it will be like designing a mechanism and then no one using it. But then the next one suddenly, like JP Morgan used to put some of their like ETF profits through. And then it's like, oh,
yeah.
okay, this is really working, and similar to
Yeah.
Ethereum as a whole, I think is like, what does working look like? Like maybe us all getting rich. So this is a nice quote from Aiden. So Aiden is the CTO at ChainSafe, and like a super good buddy. Sort of ChainSafe and FireEyes are almost like sister companies, like started at really similar times. Now they do significantly more technical work than we do philosophy, but similar energy. And Aiden said to me like something about how Ethereum or whatever crypto wins, where it's like, actually, for this technology to win, we can't all get rich. Like, and I thought that was like quite interesting as a statement. Is that like, if we are moving to this equitable, fully owned world by everyone, where we all have a voice and we all have a say, then actually like being rich inside of that becomes very, very challenging. And so I think like that's like quite a unique perspective when thinking about a lot of these funding mechanisms, where it's like, well, perhaps a funding mechanism where 10 different organizations get 10 mil and another 100,000 each get $10, this isn't the direction we want to go, right? Maybe everyone has to get
Yeah.
$150, or different contribution levels. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I love that answer. And there's a couple things I want to react to, and maybe one I'll start with is that you kept on talking about people distributing money. The bone I'll pick with you there is that I think you have to allocate the money before you can distribute it. So
Yeah, I guess I was
you got
using
to use
that.
the buzzword.
Yeah. True.
But
Okay,
but
sorry. We're not
the,
distributing
the
money, we're allocating money.
Yeah, come on, be on brand. No, so I mean, I am shit posting here, but I will say that like we've kind of broken it down. We think that there's going to be so we can now program our values into our money, and there's just design space where we can be really explicit about what we want to do. And Rena and I kind of think that like there's three phases of capital. There's accumulating the capital, which is when you do your TGE. And then there's allocating the capital to whatever your goals are, whether they're impact or profit. And then after that, we feel like there's a distributing of the capital from there. But in order to distribute the capital, say like a cross bridge transfer, like a Merkle transfer, radical drips, or something like that, you have to allocate to fund what matters to you. And I guess I just want to hear you react to that unfurled in front of you. And you can use, the words distribute and allocate in your answer. It's fine. That was just the shit post as a lead in for my question.
Yeah, no, well, I think I agree. I think that that first part of it, which is deciding what you value, is at least what I've found in this space as the hardest part.
It is the hard part,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, like
Because these are all
distributing it.
abstract and pithy until there's actually money to be distributed, and that's where the rubber
Yes.
meets the road.
And then you have, 100,000, even as a small example, right? Given the use cases we're talking about here, $100,000, and X number of organizations or people that need to receive it. And like, it becomes a very political and very messy game of trying to decide who gets what. And, like even some of the work, to reference back to optimism, and like I'm a badge holder and I'm a delegate and we're big supporters and like, love optimism. But when they started to quantify, the impact and the value a lot more, I started to go, I need to vote in the opposite direction here. I'm going to vote in a different direction because as you try and quantify a lot of these metrics too much, they just become like toxic and worse, at least in my opinion, of like you're going through and saying, oh, well, how many transactions did you have? Or what TVL did you bring in? Versus the way that in some of the earlier rounds and the way that I was distributing my vote was I know this team, I know this person, they are really, they have done amazing work historically, and I think they could do excellent work in the future, which, was almost explicitly not the instruction, right? The instruction was like, it's only looking on retroactive work. But you've actually got to think of you can't just do that, right? If two teams have both done the exact same amount of retroactive work and one of them is really inspired to keep building and the other one is burnt out and doesn't want to continue, I don't want to give them the same amount of money, right? So like impact isn't just, even retroactive impact, just viewing it in a past tense lens, I think muddies the water. And I think what Optimism have fell into now with their most recent rounds is it becomes so programmatic that you don't even need a human, right? Like I'm sitting there sort of sliding some sliders from like 66% to 33%.
Yeah, this
And
is
it,
because you're funding different impact metrics as opposed to the projects themselves. It makes it
yes,
very it abstracts away a lot of these problems from the badge holders.
yeah,
Badge
which
holders being the people who are voting on where the capital gets allocated.
exactly. Yeah,
No.
you're good context laying. And I think that like, that sets things up to be more programmatic and to be more like, fair of like, hey, we are just looking at these metrics and how to use. But then I'm going down the metrics and going like, why would you use, the 10 users that like come back to the protocol twice a month? Why is this a metric? And how did we get to quantifying this metric? And Optimism have, big councils that are sort of deciding these metrics. But like as you like numerate the impact, more and more, I think it becomes harder and harder to actually like stand for something and say, hey, look, this is why I did this is because of this reason and this output. And instead it becomes very calculative where it's like, oh, well, they got the most points, they got the most numbers. And so we have to give them that reward. And I think at least maybe that's an end state. I'm quite excited about that maybe in 30 years' time, is that money can really flow through mechanisms like that. But I think for how early we are and for how many rent extractors are sort of inside of these ecosystems, is that you actually need some like really hard words. And I don't see a lot of that, of actually, people really being put in their place and said, hey, look, sorry, you don't get anything here because, you know, we don't think it was important enough, versus like you had, 15% of the transactions. So we have to give you this allocation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things in the design space, but I'm going to zoom us back out just so that we can focus on the design space of capital allocation. And as Allo is launching retro funding tools, I'm sure we'll get more down some of these rabbit holes with retro funding. The other thing that I want to react to is what you said about this sort of like the blog post to working DApp flow, where I think you said that we come up with all these elegant mechanism designs, and then very few people actually do it. And I've been thinking a lot about this because my life is, my work is actually mechanism design, quadratic funding. And one of the things when I reflect on this, and especially as we've written books about capital allocation on chain and everything, how with Gitcoin we fell ass backwards into this really powerful but really complicated mechanism. QF is magical because you give $1 and the project gets $100, and that feels great when you do that. But behind that, you have to keep topping up the matching pool. You have to build a social movement to do that. You have to have Sybil resistance. You have to have collusion resistance. And, without going into all the nitty gritty about mechanism design, I'm actually really proud that Gitcoin took all of those things very seriously. But I kind of felt like I was fighting a battle with like two Achilles heels, because there's so much complexity in QF. And I'm wondering if a way that we can solve the, mechanism design to actually using the mechanism gap is by just starting with simple mechanisms. Stuff that like if you're three people, a group chat with a bank account that you'd actually want to use because it's so simple. And there's actually a couple of mechanisms that we're farting around with right now that are just like single state machines. They're pretty fucking easy to use. And I'm wondering if you think that that's the gap that we need to do to have more people actually using cool mechanism design, like simplicity is elegance, or do you think it's something else or both?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think probably both. My first initial thought is like resonates with like a lot of the stuff that the DAO House guys have built. And so like Vin and Deacon and Sam and they've built DAO House and Ray Guild and a sort of series of like very human
Tools to
tools,
make it
right?
easy to launch Molotov.
Yeah, yeah, Moloch does, but also stuff like Yeta, right? And I mean, a Yeta is still a Moloch DAO, but it sort of is, the three friends with
Yeah.
a big account that want to do something. And
A-
so,
And
yeah,
and a funny thing is I Googled the word yeet and it means to throw something carelessly without effort. So like to yeet out a Moloch DAO is way easier than like filling out some long form with all the parameters in it. So I think that
exactly.
simplicity is what I'm resonating with there.
Well, yes, exactly. And like, with what you're saying, if I totally hear that. But I think my immediate reaction is like, first we need the culture of you need the three friends to get to want to do this, and
Mhm.
to
You
understand
have
that
to
they
have a
can
problem
do
to
this.
solve and people
Yeah.
that want to do it.
And I think that, like, that's actually the thing that we're struggling more with, is that, like, from a, there's, like, 2 lenses here, right? There's, like, a from a crypto perspective, which I think maybe we'll talk about in a second, but then from, like, the wider world perspective, that actually there are 3 friends right now that would like to coordinate around something that costs money, right? And, like, this is happening, I mean, hundreds of thousands of times per week, all across the world. There is, like, this example where people do wanna work together to coordinate capital, but they don't have the tools, right? And it's like, well, we can't set up a company, we can't bank transfer someone, so we'll get it all out in cash, but maybe we have a limit on how much cash we can get, or we don't want to carry the cash around. It's like all of these barriers to actually solving that problem. But there's certainly people that would like to coordinate in that way. And so I think from like a retail or more traditional perspective, the answer is like we actually need to instantiate more of these ideas, which I don't think Trump coin and
Mhm.
Central African Republic coin are doing. I don't think the meme coins are that answer. And if anything, it's actually the opposite of what you're training people to do. But I think slowly, like maybe not even Ethereum, but Ethereum's values of the sort of like decentralized ownership and, wanting to contribute to something that you own because you want to build a better world, these like philosophies are slowly disseminating out. And like, I am seeing that, like I was on the ski lift here the other day, and this kid was talking about like Ethereum and smart contracts. Like, yeah, we're learning about it at school, and like our friends are talking about it. It's like, wow, that's a very impressive school in Sun Valley. But like, that idea is slowly getting its way into culture, and I think that will take decades to do. And so that's, I think, the answer on the retail side is no matter how many tools we build, we actually need the humans to want to use it first. And then on sort of the more like crypto or like these larger networks or token projects that want to sort of distribute revenue, capital, is like
Allocate revenue.
allocate. Yes, sorry,
Yes.
allocate capital. This episode is sponsored by allocation. But if they want to if these larger protocols want to allocate money in different directions, they have the problem, right? Like unlike the three friends, that don't know about Ethereum, don't know about smart contracts, they might have the problem, but they can't solve it. In the crypto example, they have the problem and they can solve it, but perhaps they don't want to solve it in the right direction. We're actually like, if you're min-maxing, for some like token number go up, or like, how many market makers and VCs we can attract in the next, 6 months, then actually like perhaps you're not distributing capital in the right way. And so again, it leads you to the same place as the three friends is,
Yeah.
but how are we going to use this effectively? And so I think, yes, I hear you, and like I totally want that, and I do agree. But I think the sort of like pessimist in me, realist in me is like, well, yes, and it's going to take a long fucking time, and it's just like something, definitely a feeling that I've had, more recently is that like I thought this was going to move really quickly. Like 10 years ago when I was first starting to mess, or maybe 9, 10 years ago when I was first starting to mess around with this stuff, I was like just finishing high school, going into college, being like, this is going to be awesome. It's going to change tomorrow. And now, sitting here jaded after 10 years, I'm like, oh, fuck, it's going to be slow. And I think, these mechanisms are like the underpinning of finance and capitalism and money, at its most purest form of like, how does money move, and what are the ways that we allocate, capital to do that. And I think there's just going to be a long, sludge. And I think, it's part of the answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing I'm sort of hearing here is an element of like there's too much solutionism out in the market right
Mm.
now, and there's not enough people that are working backwards from problems that people actually have, and there's too many people working forwards from solutions.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to that? I mean, that's a reductionist summary of what you said. I think there's only one element of it, but it feels like it's at least one.
Yeah, totally, totally. It's like
Yeah.
we want to use the mechanisms more than we do want to solve any specific problem.
You and I have sidebarred about my vision for Allo and how it's sort of a continuation of where Gitcoin was going, and I'm just wondering, if you have any advice for me. And like maybe one pointed question would be like, say we do launch a governance token one day. Let's say it's called Allo. How would you allocate Allo? And so I think that there's a meta problem of allocating Allo if we want to have a legitimate capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. How would you do it in a way such that it's legitimate and actually helps summon that capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet, which we think is like $1 billion opportunity. You've seen a lot of stuff. What do you think that we should pay
Mhm.
attention to? What are the patterns or anti-patterns?
Mm. I think my first thought is that, which we've talked about before, right, is that any good spin out should have a very healthy allocation to the DAO it spun out from. And so, like I think one way in which this applies to Allo,
So do right by
Gitcoin.
Gitcoin is
Yeah,
the
exactly.
is the
And
thing.
like
Yeah.
actually overly do right. Because there's like, if there's three variations, I guess there's four. There's like, don't do anything, you know, give something, but it's not quite right, give just enough and give more than enough. And I think sort of in that, and that's how airdrops are perceived as well, right? Like in doing a lot of airdrop design, there's like four sort of character classes, four user groups, right? There's like, I don't get anything, I'm pissed off. There's, I get a small amount and I'm probably pissed off. There's, I get like a decent amount and I'm not too upset. And then there's I get a lot, I'm really happy,
So,
right? And
so
like,
everyone's pissed off except for that last category.
yes,
Great.
yes, yes.
I'll be
Which is
prepared
which
for
is
that.
yeah, and that is the way that airdrops have now been perceived, right? And like, I think there's ways that we can innovate on top of that, but like that is the way they land. And so similarly is that if we think about those user groups from the perspective of Gitcoin DAO or any spin out DAO, right? Making sure that the DAO is in that fourth bucket is more important than any individual getting an airdrop. So that's like the first thought. The
So
second
let's
is that
can
Mhm.
we take these one by one and we'll
Yeah,
go
yeah,
through a couple different ideas that you have.
yeah,
So I think that you're like a couple thoughts that I have about this. And by the way, like for the listener, none of this is baked. We're still exploring the design space. And if you're skilled at following me on Twitter and reading between the lines, you'll know that there's an open DAO design competition going on the Allo forums right now. So none of this is baked, and we're all sort of talking hypothetical. And on doing right by Gitcoin, I had a couple thoughts there. Assuming there is another token, which I'm not sure. I'm not saying there will be. I'm not committing to that at that point. Like not only having some of it go back to Gitcoin, the treasury, but also users of Gitcoin, Gitcoin stewards, and like individuals who hold GTC. I think there's an element of like proof of true believer there because I remember the hype when we launched and people were just over the moon about GTC in 2021. But it feels like over the last 4 years we've been kind of left for dead a little bit. And I like the idea of baking into the mechanism design like a proof of true believer, where like if you dumped on us over the last 4 years, you get less of an allocation or something like that. Like so, those are a couple of knobs that I could see playing with there. And I just wanted to get your reaction to that before we move on to the next point.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that like I 100% endorse that and I want that. I think the challenging thing is like as you start to look at allocating a token airdrop and then you start to look at the number of users that fall into each category, very quickly you run out of tokens. And like said from much experience is that like oftentimes people are like, oh, we need to reward this group and like, oh, I love these NFTs and let's do that. And like a really big one that was really consistent was solo validators. Was like we should give solo multiple projects we worked with wanted to give solo validators an airdrop, and then you look at the numbers and you go, how the fuck are we going to give each person $1,000? And then that's going to be relative to someone that, or like $500, even $100, even. But then that's relative to someone that's had $10,000 in our protocol for 2 years. And then you start to do the math, and it's like airdrops are done. You compare how good your airdrop is based on everyone else, no other metric. So if you see someone else got 10 grand worth of tokens and you got $10, you are pissed off. But if you get $11 and the most that anyone got is $15, then you sort of feel okay with it. And so I think there's like a really interesting piece of comparison there where like, yes, we do want to reward all of these user groups and like, like the people like Gitcoin, GTC holders and different people that have interacted with the ecosystem in different ways. But then you start to look at the sheer numbers of how many people fall into these categories and how much can we actually give them that feels meaningful? Because I'm of the position that fewer people with a higher amount is actually much more impactful than a really wide distribution. Not to like maybe one example, without being too mean, is Shapeshift. When Shapeshift launched their token, we had some really early conversations with them, and it was like, oh, this seems like a pretty hectic way to do the airdrop. But they were like, no, we want to do the widest airdrop that ever happened, right? And they did that successfully. They airdropped to the most addresses ever, but it was nothing. Everyone got 5 cents, and the token went straight down because no one made any noise about it, right? And so, like, there is this thing of like, you want to airdrop to a wide enough group that you don't alienate people, but not too wide that you don't that no one cares. And so I think, in essence of, to answer what you were referencing of like when we think about the Gitcoin ecosystem and sort of supporting parts of that machine, how we airdrop to them is a unique challenge.
Do you think that there's a meta with so like I think in 2021 people would do like an initial distribution that was designed to be pristine and set the initial conditions for DAO. But I feel like there's been some projects that are doing ongoing like quarterly or like yearly airdrops in order to tighten the feedback loop between the contributor behavior and the actual project itself. And I was thinking that like, well, if the real hard problem here is finding builders that are building Allo infrastructure, then maybe instead of like one big airdrop, there's quarterly airdrops that reward the people that are actually building stuff that has PMF. So you just find a metric that of what has PMF and you just like continuously airdrop tokens to that group in order to attract them into your flywheel or something like that. Is that a meta that other people are exploring?
Well, and certainly optimism is, right? And Arbitrum, and I
Mm.
think there's like the L2s are because they
Yeah.
need to, because you must keep incentivizing people to be on your layer two, because otherwise they might go to another layer two, because there's so many of them that exist. And so I think a lot of the continuous airdrops that have happened to date have been more about user retention than they have
But
about sort
that's
of
in a
like,
commodified space, right? Like, like if I was smart, I would actually start a layer two because then people would know what the fuck I'm selling, like block space. Whereas like I don't think anyone knows quite what Allo or Gitcoin is even still. But I think that like we'd be attracting builders if we were to do it in this case.
yeah, well, and agree. And I think doing like continuous airdrops is good, but I think like it is a delicate balance to see a non L2 do continuous airdrops without their token price suffering massively. I don't think there's any examples from my internal token database. But like I think that that's a very, very challenging thing to do. And like, yes, maybe if you have revenue, right? If you've got some serious revenue, then I think doing another airdrop is acceptable. Or like, it's a shitload of buy demand on the token, then like maybe that's acceptable. But I don't know of many use cases that have done that. But that's not to say that it's a bad thing. I think that, similar to what we are talking about at the beginning, right, of like the retroactive funding, that's the same thing. Having continuous airdrops every quarter is just a sort of different version of retroactive rewards, where it's like based on your actions inside of the protocol, you're getting rewarded. Yes, I think that is true, and I think it is a good idea. However, you do also need a big enough bang at the beginning to get people excited. And like that is sort of the math there is like, yes, we want to give out more tokens in the future, but if we give out 1%, I won't use that example actually, but if we give out 1%, on day one, then like suddenly you're in this position where no one cares, right? No one got enough tokens to actually feel bought in. And so then you do an airdrop and then it's like, oh, you can get more in 6 months. It's like, I might be able to, but I didn't even get enough the first time to care. And so there's this weird math between, yes, you want to give them out continuously, but you don't want to give out too little at the beginning because then people won't feel engaged to keep building in the first place. It does raise me to it takes me to the second thought that I was going to say earlier
Let's
too,
keep going by all means.
which, which is like, I'm very bullish on airdrop and token distributions being community guided. And so it's, like that's similar to this proposal process, the open DAO proposal process that's going on right now on the forum of Allo. It sounds like, which I need to read up on. Like that process sounds like one of these. And I had a conversation this morning actually with a project, a quite used project inside of the Ethereum ecosystem. And my proposal to them was, well, why don't we launch the token in a way where first you say, users, should we launch a token? Then you say, how many should the team get? How many should the airdrop get? How many should the investors get? And you just like make everyone decide on what those allocations could be. And I think another example to that is, hey, how should we conduct our airdrop? Please submit, here's the data of all of our users and here's the total data set. Design this airdrop the best way you can, and the community will vote on how that airdrop happens. And there's another example of that, which is going, and I think Obel is doing an example. Obel's doing an example of that right now. And I know of another one probably coming up where like some type of retroactive grant will be built into the distribution, right? So like you cannot collect your airdrop unless you distribute to other people that have also made high impact. And so that's sort of like four different examples, right? Well, three or four different examples in the same design space of like, I think especially with the meta right now of, I mean, all this Libra stuff with the, Argentinian coin is going to come out in the wash, and we're going to see a list of like, 200 KOLs that were part of this machine, and they helped launch Tour coin and Trump coin and, the Argentinian coin, Libra, and they are all part of the same fucking group. And I think it's like, it's very telling that Solana, has like made this their machine of, yes, this is so good. Look at all these meme coins, how great it is. And then you actually look behind the curtain and you just see the same 17 people that have been going round and round and round and round for the past year. And so the exact opposite of this, right, which is like you see these token allocations and the pie chart isn't even on the website, and you don't know how they're vesting, and you don't know who's holding what, and you have no fucking idea, right? And that's like meme coins have become. And instead, we sort of push in the exact opposite direction of that, right? Which is like, how many tokens should there be? Who should get the first 10? Like how should the team get any? Should the investors get any? How many should they get? How should we do the airdrop? And sort of like by putting these questions to the people that are buying in, it means that when I'm buying in, I'm not just showing up to Radium or whatever meme coin exchange and pressing buy to buy Tour coin and hoping that goes up because it's a good meme. And instead I'm like, I've used this thing for a while, and now they're asking me how many tokens I should get. Well, I should definitely get the most, but like how many should go to the airdrop? Like maybe it should be a reasonable amount. How many should go to the team? Well, they built it, so maybe a decent amount. Like getting to each community deciding to lean into that. That's going to be a meta this year, for sure.
You think so?
And
Like instead
100%.
of the a fair launch being defined as like the team gets nothing, and whoever snipes it gets it. That doesn't seem fair to me. But like the neo fair launch or like a meritocratic launch could be the community decides maybe through some allocation software what the airdrop is. So you invite the community in before the actual airdrop.
100%. That multiple projects will do that this year, I think.
Yeah. I think it's a fun little like troll actually, like that the people that are still following me on Twitter are invited into this DAO design where they get to define the airdrop, and the people that have left us for dead, just get nosy because they're not paying attention. Like, I don't know, that feels like there's something karmic to me there, but
It's like poetic.
maybe I've just got a
Yeah,
chip on
yeah.
my shoulder.
But maybe both.
Yeah. I want to zoom in on the point of revenue because I think that it's all like the dynamics are just totally different if this thing has revenue, which implies some longevity, versus it not having revenue. And And I think that, like, Gitcoin is an interesting data point here because it did $1.1 million in revenue in 2024 on $10.6 million in volume. So, like,
Mhm.
a naive take might be, well, about 10% of your platform volume can come back to you in revenue, and that'll be some combination of service fees, protocol fees, and retroactive airdrops and stuff like that. Um, and I guess I'm just wondering, for your reaction, is revenue important? And B, like, what kind of take rate do you think for like an ecosystem of capital allocation apps makes sense in different forms and flavors of revenue? Because that feels like an important design criteria, like to at least have a finger on the pulse of.
Yeah. It is interesting, like, to answer the first question about how important is revenue, it is interesting of like, would it help or hinder optimism if all of the, or Arbitrum, if all of the fees from the L2 started to go into a multi-sig that was claimable by token holders, right? Like, I don't know if it would help them. I think actually the idea of like it's like the Silicon Valley meme, right? Where it's like, "Don't make revenue." Whatever you do, don't make revenue.
It does
And
feel
so
like
I
there's an uncanny valley where like the meme coin people can get away with anything as long as they can create enough attention. And
well, they can't,
then there's like all of us regens over here who are expected to actually have things that are sustainable. And for that you need cash flows. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think on the meme coin front, like, that's not true, like, they have all collapsed, I haven't bought many of them, but one of the beginning was, Mother, right? It was Iggy Azalea's one, because I was like, "Listen, she seems like she's pretty into this, and she's, like, seriously committed to the longevity of this, and so I'll get some as, like, a, interesting meme to follow along with," and it's just dropped down only, right? Down 90%, and so there has been meme coins that have made money, but, the way that you make money from a meme coin is not by buying one, it's by launching one. And so, like, and that's why they've all gone straight up and straight down. And so, like, I don't even think that the first part of that's true, of like these meme coins are all going to evaporate, at least as I've seen them. But in relevance to revenue around that, there's only one protocol that has decent revenue inside of Ethereum, right? And that's ENS. And they have, managed to pull in 100 mil or so of 80 mil of revenue, partly because they made a bunch of revenue early and then the price of ETH went up a bunch, which is a good strategy. But most other protocols have like, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue, maybe a couple of mil at most. And so like there's not many protocols that have a lot of revenue. And the usual token design method says don't make too much revenue or people might start comparing your token price to your revenue and sort of find out that maybe they shouldn't be holding the token. And so I'm not necessarily in favor of like min-maxing for revenue, but I do think that, like, it is one lever, like, a buyback and burn is not a good mechanism, right? Now, Maker might have implemented it as the first token mechanism, and they might be able to get away with it, but all it takes is one black swan, and you've just undone 10 years of burning, right? And so, like, it doesn't seem to me to be the best token model ever, but the idea of, like, having ETH, maybe you stables if you're more conservative, but having ETH in a treasury that can be one leveraged if ETH goes up because we're all building inside this ecosystem. So you sort of want to capture that upside. And two, that like it can be deployed tactically to bring value to the protocol and token holders. Right now, inside of that sentence, tactically has a huge amount of meaning, right? And is pretty arbitrary. But it's like if the community think it's a good idea and consistently they're seeing good upside or good return from doing this thing with their ETH, and whether that be just sitting on it or using it to reinvest in some other protocol or making investments as a protocol or delivering it to token holders, whatever that revenue is done with, it is a very nice notch in the belt of hey, tokens do nothing, which is true, right? I think universally, like tokens do not do anything. Maybe some like staking slashing inside of a couple of protocols, but even then, the token hardly does anything, right? They do governance, and they do like in a blue sky version in 50 years time, this protocol is going to be really valuable, and this token will be the pivotal part of this protocol, right? And if that's the assumption, then actually like yes, revenue is good, but what you do with the revenue and how you sort of position the revenue is actually like more important than the revenue itself.
I have so much more I want to wrap with you, and I feel like we just caught like a
Just
real
yeah,
vibe
yeah.
like in the last half hour. But maybe I'll start winding us down because I know that we have to go in 5. But like, is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
Not really. I mean, I think it's like I agree with like, I feels like this tail end of it is like very juicy, good stuff that like the universe should definitely know, but there's always more time to chat.
I'll just sort of like end in and say my vision for Allo, and I'd love to get you react to that, and then we can break. But I think what we want to do is we want to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet, or fund many small tools that will be capital allocation tools for that tokenized internet. And I see this as like a multi-billion-dollar design space. And it's been a great, beautiful journey for me to have built Gitcoin and to have supported thousands of people, $67 million distributed so far. You know, I always look back to Joe Lubin and Consensus and how they were the first people to believe in me when I was building Gitcoin. And I'm really hoping that like this is a fractal forward that builds the next 10 Gitcoins, the next 10 crowdfunding applications. And hopefully the end result is just an order of magnitude more impact. And you know, this time around, I would actually like to like make it into a profitable venture instead of like, you know, something that's, you know, kind of like nonprofit, like regen impact coded from the beginning. And so any sort of final words of wisdom or like 2025 metas that you think that we should take advantage as we're summoning Allo Capital over the next several quarters?
My first thought was when you're talking about Gitcoin and sort of like, how Gitcoin defines success. And it's like, spinning out from consensus and like bringing up a lot of people and a lot of people getting to say they worked at Gitcoin. There is the amount of people that contributed to Gitcoin that went on to do amazing things is also much higher than the average, whatever project that is launched. But then there's all of individual projects that have received funding through Gitcoin. And like, if there was a way for those organizations to give back, right, to Gitcoin, or where they were mandated to, or, we could ask them, or like, if they built something successful, and maybe not even as a direct result of that funding, right? Of like, hey, I got $50,000 from Gitcoin and then I built this thing, but then I went on to build this other thing, right? That was even amazing, but that wasn't even funded from the Gitcoin grant. But all to say, there was like a whole ecosystem that was developed there. And I still have a lot of time for like that impact, that actually like there was a shitload of individuals that were always getting money from Gitcoin. And even if it was only a little bit, right? It sort of like started that journey in the early days of Ethereum. And so that's an interesting dynamic when thinking about like that total impact versus token value or revenue or anything else, right? And sort of like the discrepancy between those. And so maybe, part of it is, when thinking about Allo, it's like, right, how do we like bake in, this? Where actually like there is a way to re-empower Allo
Sure.
protocol by the organizations that go through it.
Yeah, I mean, I look at like someone like Elon Musk. Well, I shouldn't talk about Elon because I know he's very controversial these days, but like something like Tesla, I think is like transforming the world through electric vehicles, but it actually has like a profit engine and that makes it more powerful over time. And if you look at like a nonprofit that just loses money and relies on donations, it doesn't have the longevity. And I think that's kind of like one of the inflection points that we might look at going at here. And I'll also say like the decisions in 2021 were driven by like how do we get out of consensus and how do we design a DAO, and we just know so much more these days about DAOs. And also I don't have as much like this is a total blue ocean to design it out in the open. And you know, I'm kind of excited about this new adventure and having sort of like a clean whiteboard to design things with everything that we know now. And so I'm cautiously optimistic. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. No, me too. I'm like definitely keen to, follow the journey and certainly review any DAO launch proposals made by the community. But I think that that idea is sick. And the idea that like it will certainly be a meta this year that having your community or having your stakeholders help design the process around these airdrops. Like I've always been quite dubious of, a lot of the time it's just like me, FireEyes, and the founders in a room designing these airdrops. And it's like, yes, this is good. And I think I'm great at it, but like I cannot be the best person in the planet on that. There is certainly, someone in the world or even someone in your community that actually has a lot of insight here. And by not having them inside of the conversation, I think we've been missing out on a lot of, upside of that design process. And so like I'm really excited for Allo and for other protocols this year to sort
Yeah.
of like lean into that.
Yeah, well, it's been fun, and I appreciate you letting me bend your ear, even though we didn't hire FireEyes for this one, and we've disrupted you by doing an open design process on the forums. Just like appreciate that you'll take the call and do the
And
podcast.
luckily, I'm sure if I wanted to be, I could be as involved as needed, Kevin.
That's true. Please work with us, please, James.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Well, appreciate your years of friendship and the contributions you made to the space. Where can people find you and FireEyes on the internets?
Yeah, so james.eth on Twitter is probably the best place. There's also FireEyes Gov on Twitter as well, and we are involved in a lot of different ecosystems of trying to be delegates and useful ones at that. And yeah, hit me up on Twitter or send a message. I'm always happy to chat about these ideas. I spend a lot of the, like a lot of time that FireEyes does isn't like commercially us getting money. It's like, how do we make the ecosystem better? And so definitely if you have a cool idea or question, happy to field that and jump on a call. No worries.
Yeah, I love that. If you're
Yep.
listening, allocate some attention to James by following him on Twitter. And thank you for allocating some of your time and mind space to us today, James. This was fun.
Absolutely, man. I'll be to chat. See you soon.
You just heard from James Waugh from FireEyes. Really excited to talk to him about DAO design in 2025 and just get his thoughts on the Allo Capital summoning. Thanks for listening to the Summoning Allo.Capital podcast powered by the Green Pill Network. This podcast features the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. Disclaimer, this podcast is for informative purposes only and is not financial advice. Do your own research. Do not make any financial decisions based off of these podcast episodes. And in addition, as a disclosure, I own crypto assets like ETH, DAI, USDC, and GTC. Thanks again, James, for coming on the episode. I really enjoyed talking to you. I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Peace, and I'll see you next time.